for listening to Uncle Sam's Soccer Podcast, keeping you up to date with the latest in American soccer. And don't forget to subscribe.
On this week's episode of Uncle Sam's Soccer Podcast, Fox Sports soccer commentator John Strong joined us on the pod to discuss his rise to becoming America's voice for soccer. We discussed MLS and big topics in the league as the playoff push begins to heat up. Fox Sports reporter Alexi Lalas went on a rant about tattooed millionaires, the U.S. men's national team. Were his points valid? All this on this week's episode of Uncle Sam's Soccer Podcast.
Hello and welcome, Uncle Sam's Soccer Podcast. I'm Steven Jodorand. The one and only Armanka Fai's on the line with me. What's going on, bro?
Nothing much, man. Missing the Cowboys game, but boy, we got a great show coming up today.
Yes, ton of different issues. And it's going to be an exciting show. But first, let's get to the main point of this show.
Yes, Steven, let's jump right into it. Joining us right now is the Fox Sports soccer commentator, America's voice for soccer, John Strong. John, how are you doing today?
I'm very well, gentlemen. Thank you for carving out some time for me. I appreciate getting to have this chat with you.
We should be thanking you for carving out some time to chat with us.
So you should be thanking my wife, who is basically the gatekeeper for all of this stuff. And if she decided 30 minutes ago that this wasn't happening, then it was off. So you thank her. And we're all just sort of living in her world. That's all good.
Well, thank you, Mrs. Strong. Gratitude from.
Thank you, Mrs. Strong.
Yes.
From Texas, we love you.
Absolutely. But John, I mean, I want to go to your roots because you're relatively really young in the broadcasting age. You've kind of just jumped straight up. But growing up, were you a passionate soccer fan? What was soccer like? You know. You were growing up, you know, in your early days, you would say MLS had just either began or wasn't even existing.
Yeah, it sort of grew up around me. You know, and the timing of things was interesting because I think, obviously, you know, if I'm born, you know, 5 years earlier or 5 years later, how different things might have turned out because, you know, when I was first playing like organized soccer, so that would have been, kindergarten, first grade, something like that. I mean, we didn't really know what it was. It wasn't around us in the way that basketball was, because in the early 90s, it was all about the Trailblazers here in Portland. Mm-hmm. You know, my dad is from Colorado. He's a lifelong Broncos fan. He raised me a fan. So you know football. And then soccer sort of starts to grow up around you. And one of my earliest memories, in fact, it was the precursor, like those very early regional cable sports networks. So the channel that became Fox Sports Northwest and is now Root Sports was Prime Sports. Mm-hmm. And we had it on cable. It's like the early 90s. And they would show, and it must have been like a 2-day delay, but they would show games. I assume they were games from England. And I didn't know who any of these teams were, but I would watch it because I was playing soccer. I was soccer on TV I watched. But it confused me so much because they would go to commercial break and they would come back and the score was different. And that was so weird. Why would you keep playing during the commercial break? Now I realize now they inserted these breaks in, just they didn't care. They put them in randomly. But for me, and my understanding as a very young kid of what sports were, you stopped the game to have a commercial break and then you came back and restarted. And it took me time to sort of, you know, figure these things out. But then it started happening really quickly. And you know, at a formative age, you've got the '94 World Cup, which was such a big deal. The launch of '96, I was in fifth grade basically when MLS started. You know, when I turned 13, I got a Nintendo 64 with the FIFA '98 Road to the World Cup. I played that game obsessively. I mean, that was how, you know, and people forget. I will argue, the FIFA video games I think are a massively underrated.
I agree 100%, John.
Sports growth, right? Because
absolutely.
And now what it does is it permeates the pop culture, and you have athletes playing FIFA, you have these tournaments all around. It becomes another part of the sport in the same way as us watching on TV. But in those early days, that was how you learned it, because the games weren't on that much. And so for me, that was how I learned who all these teams were and these players. And, you're starting to get bits of the internet. And, even before I was able to twist my parents' arm to get Fox Sports World, I would make time every Sunday afternoon. Lionel Bienvenu would host the Premier League review show that Fox Sports World would put out on the FSN affiliates. And it was a 2-hour show every Sunday afternoon. It was sort of like Match of the Day. And you would have a condensed main game and then highlights from the others and other new stuff. And it was this guy, Lionel Bienvenu, who then became a local sports reporter in Denver. He's still in Denver working for, I think, the ABC affiliate or something like that. That was this early sort of icon of American soccer broadcasting, and then everything just explodes from there. So that's one of the fun things, is because I remember a time when it wasn't nearly as accessible as it is. I remember a time when I would get in arguments on the radio, just try to talk about it. I would include a Timbers score in my morning sports report, filling in on the big news talk station here in Portland when I was first out of school, and I would get the sports director being like, yeah, don't talk about soccer in these places. No one cares. And so particularly for Portland, it becomes such a big deal locally, but even nationally, just to see how big a part of the pop culture the sport is now is really gratifying. Now, in saying that, we're talking right now during an NFL Sunday. And trust me, I experienced this firsthand when we're putting our games on Sunday afternoons on FS1. Man alive, when football hits college and NFL, it's just a tidal wave that crushes everything. And so you get reminded in sort of a cynical way of just, we got a long, long ways to go still. But then the day before, when you've got 70,000 people in Atlanta, you've got 30,000 in Cincinnati, the TV ratings, while small, continue to grow year over year. So those are the types of things you sort of hang your hat and go, okay, you know what, whatever else, we're making good progress here, and it's so far beyond what it was, when it was just sort of scratching at the surface of trying to get any sort of soccer into your life when you were a kid.
It's crazy that you talk about like you growing up with somebody, because when I was 14 or 13 or something like that, I got hooked on MLS watching NBC by watching Arlo White. After Arlo left for the Premier League coverage, you came in, so I grew up watching you, which is kind of crazy to think about. So your rise to becoming, I would arguably say, America's voice for soccer, it's incredible. I mean, because like 5-6 years back, you were just at Fox Sports Northwest. How's that rise like? Can you just talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of lucky breaks. It's a lot of right place, right time. The timing of the stuff, the number of times I've been in a situation where a team or a network executive or someone is trying to find, a sort of, we need a new young American voice, and I was sort of like the only option that they had. It happened at NBC. It was helpful with the Timbers. I mean, all these things. And you think about how things could have gone differently. I just recently, in fact, we celebrated a 10-year anniversary for the sports talk show that I wasn't ever the main host. I was the sidekick and like the ran the board and did updates and stuff like that with one of my best friends. But we celebrated sort of 10 years of launching the show, and it was funny to think back to 10 years ago in the fall of 2007 when we launched this thing, and I had just that weekend, it was like my first legit away Timbers game I got the chance to call at the Carolina Railhawks. It was an internet broadcast, and the regular guy was working that weekend, so he couldn't go. And then I'm launching the show, and then a few weeks after that, I had fought with my host, who is a soccer skeptic, very much so, but has come around. His co-host at the time, an absolute soccer hater, but I love him anyway. And Don Garber was coming into town. Don Garber was coming to Portland. Merritt Paulson had just bought the A-League Timbers and the AAA baseball team. The U.S. women had a game in Portland that night, and so Don Garber was in town, and so I was like, we got to get him on. This would be great, and this is like the first time I'm booking a guest, and it's our first soccer thing. I'm so excited. Well, very long story short, because there's a whole bunch of reasons why this happened. the host, John, hung up on Don Garber live on the air after basically fighting with him on the air for 10 minutes.
Wow.
Of like, Soccer's not going to make it here. What good is it for the city? What kind of tax money? I mean, all this stuff, just an antagonistic interview. And then he hangs up on him live on the air. And then I go to the game afterwards, and it's like everyone in the press box is looking like, hey, kid, thanks for ruining soccer in Portland. And that's how I felt at the time. Like, I had just blown it for the entire city. And now, of course, things have turned out a little bit better. And I haven't got I actually saw Don the other week, but I haven't been able to bring that up in the years since. Do you remember when you got hung up on live? That was my fault. So it is fun to think back to how quickly things have evolved, and all you ever try to do is just take advantage. You know, when a door is opened, you just try to run through it. You lower your shoulder, you work as hard as you can, you try to be as good a teammate as possible, you try to constantly learn, never act like you got it figured out. And even now, I mean, listen, I haven't made anything. I've been presented with some wonderful opportunities, but at the end of the day, this is still sort of show business. You know, it's still Hollywood type stuff. It can be taken away from you. And so my mentality, and it's not false modesty, it's actually my mentality, is I got to be good every time I go out there. And I got to make sure I continue to be good as we approach the World Cup. I got to make sure I'm good at the World Cup, because if I stink, they're not going to give that to me again. You know what I mean? Sure. These are always situations where you oftentimes get sort of, not that your bosses say, I'm only giving you one shot, but people change their mind easily. And particularly when it's something as subjective as the sound of an announcer's voice. It's sort of like music or movies. It just depends on the person listening, whether they like it or not. And so I'm always in that mode of, you know, have to constantly sort of continue to prove that I can do this, because, being young and being American, and not being a well-known voice from another sport, I don't fit any of the templates that have come before for sort of a lead soccer announcer for American television. So it's that constant thing of until I don't know when I get to a feeling where, okay, maybe I'm set here. I'm always in that mindset of having to make sure every single time it's an MLS game, Bundesliga, Champions League, whatever, that I'm putting out my best work so that I continue to sort of, you know, make sure everyone that's above me is like, okay, this is the guy we still want to have here.
Now you've kind of like, you know, you've kind of done what soccer has done here. It's just grown. You know, people said no, has no chance, and you just continue to climb the ladder. Now, do you see soccer really and MLS really, you know, being alongside the NFL, the NBA, the NHL, and the MLB as America's sports leagues, or will it always be the fifth?
I actually think it's a really, really interesting conversation. I don't have the answers. I don't know the answers. But it's a fascinating subject to think about, because I think on the one hand, the biggest mistake that people tend to make when they have these types of conversations, particularly those people who are not as inclined to like soccer in the first place, is they sort of forget their own history of American sports. The NFL was not always the big thing that it was. The NBA was not always the big thing that it was. These sports leagues change hugely as the market changes around them. The anecdote I always like to share is, before I was born, sort of the big moment in Portland sports history was the Trailblazers winning the 1977 NBA championship. Bill Walton was the star of that team. They beat Julius Erving and the Philadelphia 76ers. Well, Game 6 of the 77 finals, and again, Bill Walton versus Julius Erving, these are two big stars, even though, you know, it was Portland in the 70s was even a much smaller town than it is now. If you go back and you watch the broadcast, first of all, the game tipped off at noon local time. CBS wanted to tip the game off at 11 because they wanted it done before they would go to coverage of the Kemper Open golf tournament. And in fact, if you listen to it was Brett Musburger calling the game for CBS. The fourth quarter of the deciding game of the NBA Finals 40 years ago, all throughout the fourth quarter, hey, reminder, stay tuned after this. The Kemper Open, live golf from like Milwaukee or whatever. Make sure to stay tuned after this. And they went. That game ended. They were off the air within 90 seconds. No trophy celebration, no nothing. The golf, because at that time, even to have a live game on, they would oftentimes tape delay games, or they put it on very late at night. You know, that's how much basketball grew very quickly through the 80s and then through the 90s, and it's even had a resurgence in the last couple of years. Same sort of story for the NFL. I mean, the reason why